Oh yeah, I started.
Okay. Okay, so we did the Moths as our short story. So our author is Helena Maria Viramontes. She was born in 1954 and she's still alive today. So I think she's 66 years old now. She is considered one of Hispanic literature's most distinguished craftsmen. She was born into a family with 8 siblings. Her family was working class. She ended up being married and she herself is the mother of 2 children. Her educational history includes a BA in English from Immaculate Heart College, a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. She's an English professor at Cornell University, and in 2006, she got the Louis Leo Literary Award.
So in addition to the Moths, some other important contributions of hers are Under the Feet of Jesus, and Their Dogs Came With Them. A lot of her work focuses on language work, poverty, and racism, and it's often used in undergraduate studies on Latino culture, multicultural literature, and women's studies.
So I did the archetypal lens. So for this lens, I looked at how well this short story fit into the archetype of a general story. So this is the path for Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, which is the basics of what makes up a story. So stories have little bits and pieces of the hero's journey, maybe all of them, maybe not all of them. So I looked at how well the Moths fit into this archetype. So the hero's journey starts off with our hero in their known territory. So in the Moths, we get this with the narrator going through what her general life is like. So she's going to venture into her quote unquote unknown when she goes into Abuelita's house. Abuelita acts as the threshold guardian, and I saw this mimicked when it said Abuelita would wait for me at the top step of her porch holding a hammer and a nail and empty coffee cans. So Abuelita quite literally blocks the narrator's entrance to her dominion, which is going to act as the narrator's church throughout this story. Then the hero must go and face challenges. So the narrator faces a variety of challenges. In this, she goes to a church and she recalls on all of her familial issues with religion. Church for her brings up bad memories concerning her father and her family. So she actually doesn't like church for that reason, but she's going to have to go and find faith through Abuelita instead of the literal church. Another challenge the narrator faces, is her issue with maturity. So when her mother, Alma, comes over to Abuelita's house, the narrator tells her mother that Abuelita fell off the bed twice yesterday. But she says this knowing that it'll make her mother upset. She feels very helpless because of the situation with her family, but she's taking out this conflict within her family only on her relationship with her mother. So this shows that the narrator is not really mature, and it's a challenge she's facing as well as her challenge with faith. So the next part in the hero's journey is the abyss, which is a rebirth, death and rebirth. So this happens when the sun was setting. The author writes that the sun was setting and it was trying almost not to set. Like there's this moment where the sun doesn't want to set and it wants to remain in the sky in all its grandeur, but it realizes it must set, and that brings the rebirth of a new day. So the narrator comes to understand that nothing is permanent because of this, and for there to be rebirth, there must be death. So the narrator's transformation then is her transformation with fidelity. She transitions with Abuelita's death to a place of faith and of understanding. This is seen through when she bathes Abuelita with the sacredness of a priest preparing his vestments. The narrator is understanding faith now and is taking on a more godly role. She also understands maturity at this point. She understands her relationship with her mother better, and instead of taking out her conflicts on her mother, she says that she wants her mother. So finally, the atonement is when the narrator is truly reborn. She understands her relationship with Alma, with faith, and with death. So looking at the archetype of the narrator fits the archetype of, first of all, an outcast. She is physically an outcast because she wasn't even pretty or nice like her older sisters, and she just couldn't do the girl things that they could do. So literally, she doesn't fit that mold that her sisters fit. She also says that emotionally, she's an outcast. She wasn't respectful either, and she has conflicts with her family as a result of her attitude. She also fits the outcast of a rebel slash sinner. She says, Abuelita had seen me through several whippings in my first lie. So she goes into this idea that she's lying a lot. So she's sinning. She says, my hands began to fan out, growing like a liar's nose until they hung by my side like low weights. So this first part reminded me of Pinocchio with his nose growing, a reference to Pinocchio. And this is her being a rebel. It's her sinning through lying. But this is where Abuelita comes in as her guidance through faith. Abuelita made a balm out of dried moth wings and rubbed them on her hands and shaped them back to their right size. So in this story, moths symbolize faith because just as moths travel towards the light, people travel towards God, and God is their light. So Abuelita, when she cleanses the narrator of sin, she uses moth wings because that symbolizes faith. So she is literally cleansing our narrator of sin. There's also the motif of light that is noticed here when the narrator remarks that Abuelita cleaning her hands was like sun shining through the darkness of your eyelids. So it is like God's light and the light of faith shining through her eyelids through Abuelita. And finally, Abuelita she fits into the archetype of the mentor in this story. Abuelita symbolizes God, faith, and church. So her gray eyes described at several points in the story. The narrator says, I always felt her gray eye on me. It would make me feel in sort of strange way, safe and guarded and not alone, like God was supposed to make you feel. So she is basically telling us in that moment that Abuelita is her symbol of faith. She's acting as her God. She's making her feel like God is supposed to make you feel. However, when the narrator is in the church, the frozen statues have blank eyes. She was alone, and she knew why she would never return. So we see in this moment that the narrator associates faith not with church, but more with Abuelita. And Abuelita's gray eye is reminiscent of a statue in church's gray eye, like a gray stone statue, their eye, and then Abuelita has that same eye that's looking down on her granddaughter. So Abuelita not only symbolizes church for the narrator, her home is a sort of holy sanctuary where the narrator goes to learn and to garden and to perform her duties. And when she goes to Abuelita's house, she finds relief. So she says, with a wooden spoon, I scraped hard to destroy the guilt, and my tears were gone. So she is finding in this sanctuary with her mentor a release. So Abuelita's point is to guide the narrator to faith, and at the end she achieves that because the narrator is able to recognize the prominence of death and understand and grow in her faith. And finally, there is a baptism at the end, or a symbol of a baptism. So when Abuelita dies, the narrator takes her into the tub and bathes her. And this symbolizes her growth into her faith because now her mentor Abuelita is gone, but she is able to take on the role of a priest and wash Abuelita in a mock baptism. And here are my questions. I asked, why does Viramontes choose our narrator as the main character rather than her mother, Alma? What is the strength in focusing on the relationship between grandmother and granddaughter? And second, what character archetype does Alma fit into, or does she fit into any at all?
So I had the psychological lens, and one concept that I found was kind of relevant to this story was Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. So our narrator is about 14 years old, which places her in the identity versus confusion phase. So she's kind of this young teenager who's learning about who she is as a person, and she's kind of discovering her values. But we also see that she's acting out. Um, so we see in paragraph 2 that she keeps a piece of jagged brick in her sock to bash her sisters or anyone who called her bull hands. In paragraph 3, she explains that she wasn't respectful, and later in paragraph 12, she explains that she became angry and just so tired of the quarrels and beatings and unanswered prayers. So we kind of get this impression of her as this frustrated teenager. However, this image kind of changes when we see her response to her grandmother's death. Losing someone you love and having to take care of their body, I think, is difficult for anyone, let alone a 14-year-old. So we kind of see this much more mature side of our narrator because she doesn't even hesitate to take care of her grandmother's body. So this side is very different from that frustrated teenager in that identity versus confusion stage. Another important concept is the norm of reciprocity, which basically means that you're going to give what you receive. So at the beginning of the story, we see that the narrator's grandmother always took care of her, especially when she was ill. We saw the one example with the potato slices and one with the ball made of moth wings. And in addition, the narrator also explains that whenever she was in the presence of her grandmother, specifically her grandmother's gray eye, she felt safe and guarded and not alone. And we see that when her grandmother dies, the narrator stays with her grandmother, and she explains, dying is lonely, and I wanted to go where the moths were, stay with her. So we kind of see this norm of reciprocity as the narrator stays with her grandmother as she takes care of her body, which is similar to how her grandmother always took care of her when she was ill. In addition, in paragraph 12, the narrator kind of repeats this thought of when do you stop giving and when do you start giving? So this kind of thought by itself shows the norm of reciprocity and this idea of receiving and giving back. So for my discussion questions, my first one focuses on the Kubler-Ross model of grief, which states that the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So how does the narrator's response to her grandmother's death either match or differ from the cycle, and why is this significant? My second question kind of focuses on conformity. So we see early on in the text that the narrator has several expectations placed upon her by both her family and society. So in what ways does she kind of conform to these expectations, or in what ways does she defy them?
So I had the gender feminist lens, and throughout the story, I saw this kind of theme that was evident in like a lot of Hispanic and Latino culture around the time, called machismo culture, and it was basically that it's like an exaggerated it's when you like, force masculinity in like, an exaggerated amount, or you kind of like represent this sense of power and pushing it onto people. And I thought that was kind of shown throughout the story. And then towards the beginning of the story, I saw that like we identified the theme of like maturing and how the main character evolved. And at the start of the story, she was kind of like more childish, and she was always judged by her family. She didn't really fit in. She was judged how like big her hands were, and she didn't fit these norms that like to be able to crochet, and like they always like they made fun of her on her appearance, and they tried to like push her into this stereotype that women should fit at the time, where they like are all pretty and just did these like at-home tasks rather than like other kind of more masculine tasks maybe. And then throughout the story, she did evolve kind of from this to a more mature state. And then on the next slide, she kind of talked about how she would talk back to her father, which at the time like wasn't really well known to do. Like the father represented this idea of the machismo culture, kind of pushing his power down on people, and she wasn't respectful to like any of her family. She would push him away, which wasn't really, because at the time these girls should like respect their family and always kind of like be submissive to what their family wants. And then the dad, I noticed when I talked about the machismo culture, so he would always push all of the problems on the rest of his family, acting like he never did anything wrong. And at this time, like the man didn't have to take care of the family, and then all the mistakes that happened were he always like blamed it on the rest of his family. And I think that was a good representation of how this machismo culture was like represented throughout the story, like how the father would was kind of pushing his power down on the rest of the family, controlling everything, and like having this idea like this toxic masculinity. And then towards the end of the story, you see the gender stereotypes kind of come back for the main character, but rather than her not fitting this like these stereotypes that she was like helping at home and always being like perfect, she did towards the end where whenever she was it was talking about on with paragraph 16 about how she was bathing her grandmother. You see at the end of the story that the character matures more and takes on more of like the stereotypical woman's role at the time, which was like more of a caretaker. And it said in the story how she was bathing her grandmother whenever she was dying, and how none of the rest of the rest of the family didn't do any of this. She had to take on that like role of a caretaker, which fit the stereotype at the time for women. That was like they would stay home and kind of take care of things around the house and keep everything like going. And then for my discussion questions, I thought about how did the gender roles change throughout the story, and then I was also wondering how do you think the story would have changed if the main character was male rather than female?
Okay, I had the biographical lens. So the author's upbringing in relation to the story of the Moths. First, many of Vera Montez's other texts are well acclaimed for their depiction of her culture. In conjunction with the Moths, Vera Montez published a story called Growing. They were all published in the same collection of stories. And this story also describes how a young woman's coming of age distinguishes her from the rest of her family. Quote, Vera Montez ultimately wishes to portray how women, in particular Chicano women, are discriminated against merely because of their sex. So this goes on to show Vera Montez's personal beliefs and how they're reflected in her writing. Vera Montez also collaborated on 2 texts listed here as validated by Vera Montez's other texts, including Growing and the ones listed above. Her culture heavily influenced her writing. This is also seen in the Moths in multiple instances. For instance, when she discusses the use of the potato slices or the moth's wings as a means of healing that her abuelita uses, or also when they're seen cooking in the kitchen in paragraph 9 where it says, quote, placing them in front of me, she turned to check the menudo. I peeled the skins off and put the flimsy, limp-looking green and yellow chiles in the molcajete and began to crush and twist and crush the heart out of the tomato, the clove of garlic, the stupid chiles that made me cry. And this just goes to show the cultural significance, not only regarding food and the healing methods with the potatoes and the moth's wings, but it also discusses culturally regarding religion when she mentions the rosaries, etc. As a woman growing up during El Movimiento, Vera Montez witnessed a cultural revitalization and reclamation for her community. During this movement, like I said, there was a reclamation and revitalization of Mexican American culture, which did stress the position of women being placed in the home. However, our author, Vera Montez, is an outspoken feminist, and she rejects the typical position of women for our narrator. Quote, I wasn't even pretty or nice like my older sisters, and I just couldn't do the girl things they could do. My hands were too big to handle the fineries of crocheting or embroidering, and I always pricked my fingers or knotted my colored threads time and time again while my sisters laughed and called me bull hands with their cute water-like voices, in paragraph 2. During El Movimiento, like I said, intersectional feminism was on the rise, which the author fully embraces, rejecting the traditional roles of women in her works, as shown by our narrator. In the quote on the previous slide, it is clear that the narrator does not match the box women were expected to fit into, though Vera Montez does not try to change this about the character throughout the story. Her individuality is actually embraced, which demonstrates the author's rejection of the stereotyped position of women in Mexican American culture at the time. We have another quote that shows this from paragraph 15, which says, quote, "There, there, abuelita," I said, cradling her, smoothing her as we descended. "I heard you." Her hair fell back and spread across the water like eagle's wings. The water in the tub overflowed and poured onto the tile of the floor. And Viramontes uses an inverted tale of La Llorona to criticize the traditional family hierarchy and offers the curandera tradition with its spiritual, medical, and community implications as an alternative role for women. So like we see, Viramontes chooses to not place the narrator in that box of what a woman is expected to be or a young girl is expected to be. And she also kind of shifts that family dynamic where the matriarch would be seen as the caregiver toward the end of the story, by showing the narrator caring for her grandmother's body after she passed. And my questions for the biographical lens are, in what ways do we see Viramontes's upbringing, specifically the position of women, reflected onto the story? As well as, in what ways do you think the cultural movement Viramontes witnessed during her youth led to the way the Moths is told? Where do you see the cultural significance?
So I did the Marxist lens. So first, I wanted to situate Viramontes within the Marxist class struggle ideals. So we kind of touched on this in our introduction, our first couple of slides, but Viramontes came from a working class family of 8. So she has experience in poverty. She grew up without the means that most had. And we also have discussed in other slides how she was influenced by El Movimiento. And this protested racism and classism against those of Mexican descent. So we can kind of see how her ideas about classism were shaped in her upbringing and like how they can relate in the Moths. And just another thing, another story that she wrote that was famous for her ideas on classism was the Requiem for the Poor. And so in this story, there's evident poverty. At first, when we see in this quote, "Abuelita had pulled me through the rages of scarlet fever by placing and removing and replacing potato slices on the temples of my forehead." We can see that they didn't, have access to the traditional modern medicine that you would typically treat scarlet fever with, which would be antibiotics at the time. And so they had to resort to more cultural, like more alternative medication. And then another example is Abuelita would wait for me at the top step of her porch holding a hammer and nail and empty coffee cans. This is referring to the coffee cans they're using to make their garden. And so it's just another example of, they don't have access to the same pots that, you would traditionally use, or a garden bed, anything like that. And finally, there was, so I would wash my feet and stuff them in my black Easter shoes that shone with Vaseline. So this is just saying that, these shoes were too small. They couldn't afford to get new ones all the time. And then instead of the traditional shoe shining or cleaning, they would use Vaseline, which is not traditionally used to shine them. And so one symbol I saw was the narrator as a symbol for the lower class or poverty. And so throughout this story, she's a little bit of a troublemaker. And she at one point says that, when she acts out, it's because she had been used to the whippings by then. She was used to the whippings. And this kind of ties into the higher crime rates and drug use that you can see from these communities that suffer from economic inequality. So in this graph from the Brookings Institute, you can see that the people in the households in the 0 to 15,000 range for their annual income are commit crime at a much higher rate. And this kind of ties into the disdain for the system that punishes them. So they suffer from systemic economic inequalities, communities, and thus, there's the disdain for this system that results in this cycle of crime and punishment. And this can be seen in the narrator, how she continues to act out and she'll be disrespectful because she is used to the whippings. She knows what the punishment will be. And another symbol I saw was that Abuelita as a victim of poverty. So we see the Abuelita was dying, looking into her gray eye and then into her brown one. The doctor said it was just a matter of days. So this kind of situates the Abuelita in this story as throughout she is, merely days from her deathbed, and this is something that the family knows. And this is a little bit of a, I guess, different than what, you know, most people who are more well off are used to with their elderly family members. For the most part, the more wealthy people will retire and, you know, spend their final days in a hospital or in a retirement home. But we see throughout this story, Abuelita is working, she's gardening, she's cooking, and this just kind of shows that she's victimized because she cannot quite afford the luxury of the retirement and leisure once she's elderly. She has to work up until her very dying days. And so I thought the moths throughout this, especially in the last scene, represent the struggle of poverty. So when she dies and the moths flee from her soul, this represents the struggle of poverty leaving her, you know, she no longer has to face that. So according to a 2011 Gallup poll, people living in poverty are nearly twice as likely to suffer from depression. So it's not like evident that Abuelita is suffering through depression. That's not like the point I'm trying to make, but it's clear that this poverty is something that does affect the grandmother. And so we can see like the mothballs, there's a point where she mixes or moth wings with Vicks rub to rub on the narrator's palms to help her with her scarlet fever. And this is kind of tying back to what I was saying, how this shows as to represent poverty. And so then in the final scene, when the moths leave her soul, it kind of uses that symbolism earlier as the moths representing poverty, is this struggle of poverty being alleviated from her body. And so my discussion questions were, what does the narrator's rejections to Abuelita's treatment of her scarlet fever say about her views on her own socioeconomic status? And how does gardening and rusted coffee cans represent the larger struggles of the narrator and her Abuelita?